On August 6, 1945, the sky above Hiroshima turned white. Not gray, not red, white. In less than a second, a flash brighter than the sun erased an entire city. Buildings collapsed like paper, shadows burned into the streets, and thousands of lives disappeared in a single moment that would change human history forever. The world would remember Hiroshima as the first atomic bombing. But hidden inside that tragedy is a story so unbelievable that many people thought it was impossible. The story of a man who survived not one, but two atomic explosions, and lived to tell the tale. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. At the time, Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He had been sent to Hiroshima for a temporary work assignment designing oil tankers for the Japanese Navy. It was supposed to be a short trip. Just a few days of work, then he would return home to Nagasaki, where his wife and newborn son were waiting. But on the morning of August 6th, his life and the history of the world would change forever. That morning started like any other. Yamaguchi woke up early, prepared for work, and walked toward the shipyard. The war had already taken a heavy toll on Japan. Cities were being bombed regularly, and air raid sirens had become part of daily life. Yet Hiroshima had been relatively untouched compared to other cities. Many people believed it might remain safe. At around 8:15 in the morning, Yamaguchi was walking toward the docks when he heard the distant sound of an airplane engine. He looked up. High above the city, a single American B-29 bomber was flying across the sky. Moments later, something began falling from the aircraft. At first, it looked like a small object slowly drifting downward. But in the next instant, the world exploded. A blinding flash consumed everything. The air itself seemed to ignite. And in that fraction of a second, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was thrown violently to the ground as the most powerful weapon ever used in war detonated above Hiroshima. He had just witnessed the birth of the atomic age. And somehow, he was still alive. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi regained consciousness, the world around him was unrecognizable. Moments earlier, he had been standing in a busy industrial city filled with workers, factories, and homes. Now, everything was gone. The blast from the atomic bomb had thrown him into a nearby ditch, protecting him from the full force of the explosion. Even so, the shockwave had ruptured his eardrums and burned large parts of his upper body. His face and arms were badly burned. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the once vibrant city had become a landscape of destruction. Buildings had collapsed. Fires were spreading everywhere. People wandered through the streets in shock, many severely injured, their clothes burned away by the intense heat of the blast. Yamaguchi struggled to stand. Every movement sent waves of pain through his body, but instinct pushed him forward. He needed to survive. As he walked through the ruins of Hiroshima, the scale of the disaster slowly became clear. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Bridges had collapsed. Thousands of people were desperately searching for family members, calling out names that would never receive an answer. Some survivors described the scene as something from another world. A silent, burning wasteland. Yet despite his injuries, Yamaguchi made a decision that would later become one of the most astonishing parts of his story. He decided to return home. His hometown of Nagasaki was nearly 300 kilometers away. Traveling that distance in normal conditions would already be difficult. But in a destroyed city, with no transportation, no communication, and chaos everywhere, it seemed almost impossible. Still, Yamaguchi refused to give up. Using sheer determination, he began moving toward the train station, hoping that somehow he might find a way back home to his wife and child. He had survived the most powerful explosion ever unleashed by mankind. But his journey was far from over. Against all odds, Tsutomu Yamaguchi managed to reach a train station the following day. Amazingly, some railway lines were still operating even after the unimaginable destruction caused by the atomic bomb. Japan was still at war, and transportation systems were struggling to continue functioning despite constant attacks. Bandaged and in pain, Yamaguchi boarded a train filled with other survivors and soldiers traveling across the country. The journey was slow and exhausting. Passengers spoke quietly about the rumors spreading through Japan. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Many people simply could not believe it. There had been bombings before, massive air raids that burned cities to the ground, but this was different. This was something no one had ever seen before. For Yamaguchi, the memories of the explosion were impossible to erase. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blinding flash. He heard the roar of the blast. He felt the ground shaking beneath him. But despite the trauma and his injuries, he had only one thought in his mind: getting home. Finally, after a long and painful journey, Tsutomu Yamaguchi arrived in Nagasaki. His wife was shocked when she saw him. His clothes were torn, his body wrapped in bandages, and he looked like a man who had walked out of a nightmare. Yet he was alive. And in the quiet safety of his home, Yamaguchi tried to explain what had happened in Hiroshima. He described the flash, the explosion, the city disappearing in an instant. Few people truly understood what he meant. But the next morning, August 9, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi would go to work and attempt to explain the event again to his supervisors. As he spoke about the terrifying weapon that destroyed Hiroshima, a second American bomber was already approaching the skies above Nagasaki, carrying another atomic bomb. And within minutes, Tsutomu Yamaguchi would face the impossible for the second time. The morning of August 9, 1945 began quietly in Nagasaki. After the unimaginable events in Hiroshima just 3 days earlier, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was still recovering from his injuries. His body ached from burns, and his ears still rang from the explosion he had witnessed. Despite this, he decided to report back to work. Japan was still at war, and even injured workers were expected to continue their duties if they were able. That morning, Yamaguchi arrived at the Mitsubishi office where he worked as an engineer. His bandages immediately caught the attention of his supervisors and colleagues. They asked him what had happened. When Yamaguchi began explaining what he had experienced in Hiroshima, many of them struggled to believe his story. He described a single bomb that had destroyed an entire city. One flash, one explosion, and everything was gone. Some of the men in the room shook their heads in disbelief. They had heard rumors about the destruction of Hiroshima, but the idea that a single weapon could erase a city sounded impossible. Yet Yamaguchi insisted. He described the blinding light, the shockwave that threw him across the ground, the fires that consumed everything, and the strange mushroom-shaped cloud rising high into the sky. As he spoke, his supervisor reportedly interrupted him. "That is impossible," the man said. "No single bomb could destroy an entire city." But at that exact moment, history was about to prove Yamaguchi right. At approximately 11 darkness to 2 in the morning, a distant aircraft engine could be heard above Nagasaki. Most people in the city barely noticed it. Air raid sirens had become common during the war, and many residents had grown used to the occasional sound of aircraft passing overhead. But this aircraft was different. High above the clouds, an American B-29 bomber named Boxcar was approaching the city. Inside the aircraft was a bomb unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was called Fat Man. And within moments, Nagasaki would experience the same terrifying flash that had destroyed Hiroshima. Inside the Mitsubishi office, Tsutomu Yamaguchi continued describing the horrors he had witnessed in Hiroshima. He tried to explain the power of the bomb, the unimaginable destruction, and the terrifying heat that had burned everything in seconds. Some of the men listened carefully. Others still doubted him. Then, suddenly, everything changed. A flash of light filled the room. For a split second, it was as if the sun itself had exploded outside the building. Yamaguchi instantly recognized it. The same blinding white light. The same terrifying moment he had experienced in Hiroshima. Without hesitation, he threw himself to the ground. Seconds later, the shockwave hit. Windows shattered. Walls trembled. The force of the explosion blasted through the city of Nagasaki. Outside, Buildings collapsed and fires began spreading rapidly. The second atomic bomb had detonated. This time, the explosion occurred about 3 kilometers away from where Yamaguchi was standing. Once again, he had been incredibly close to one of the most destructive events in human history. And once again, he survived. Many people in Nagasaki were not as fortunate. The blast devastated large portions of the city. Factories, homes, schools, and entire neighborhoods were destroyed within seconds. Thousands of lives were lost. The sky filled with smoke, dust, and the now infamous mushroom cloud rising high into the atmosphere. For the second time in 3 days, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had witnessed an atomic explosion with his own eyes. 2 cities. 2 bombs. 2 moments that changed the world forever. And somehow, the same man had survived both. After the explosion, chaos quickly spread across Nagasaki. Sirens began echoing through the city as survivors tried to understand what had just happened. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the experience felt almost unreal. Just 3 days earlier, he had stood in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb exploded. Now he had witnessed another one in his own hometown. It seemed impossible. Some later described his survival as one of the most extraordinary coincidences in modern history. But at that moment, Yamaguchi was not thinking about history. He was thinking about his family. His wife and young son were somewhere in the city. With smoke rising into the sky and fires spreading everywhere, he feared the worst. Ignoring his injuries, he began moving through the damaged streets toward his home. The destruction was massive, but because of the hills surrounding Nagasaki, parts of the city had been partially shielded from the blast. As Yamaguchi made his way through the streets, he desperately hoped that his family had survived. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey through the devastated city, he reached his neighborhood. To his immense relief, he found his home still standing. His wife and child were alive. Incredibly, they had survived the second atomic bombing as well. For the second time in 3 days, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had escaped death. But the war was not over yet. And the world was only beginning to understand the terrifying power of the atomic age. In the hours after the second explosion, Nagasaki was plunged into confusion and fear. Smoke covered the sky, fires burned across large sections of the city, and survivors wandered through the streets trying to understand what had just happened. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the shock was almost beyond comprehension. Only 3 days earlier, he had watched Hiroshima disappear in a flash of light. Now the same terrifying event had struck his own city. He had survived both. But survival did not mean life immediately returned to normal. Yamaguchi's injuries were serious. The burns on his arms and face had worsened, and the constant ringing in his ears made it difficult to hear clearly. Still, he focused on protecting his family. His wife had taken shelter during the explosion, and their baby son had been safely inside their home at the time of the blast. The hills around Nagasaki had helped shield parts of the city from the full force of the explosion, which likely saved their lives. Even so, the danger was far from over. None of the survivors truly understood the long-term effects of radiation. Many people who had initially survived the blast would later fall ill in the days and weeks that followed. But in those first moments, survival meant finding water, food, and shelter. Yamaguchi joined countless others searching through the damaged city for supplies and for missing loved ones. The destruction was overwhelming. Entire districts had vanished. Factories were reduced to twisted metal. Hospitals were overwhelmed with injured civilians. Doctors and nurses struggled to treat thousands of victims with almost no medical supplies. For many survivors, the days after the bombing felt like living inside a nightmare. And yet, beyond the ruins of Nagasaki, the war itself was coming to an end. In the days following the bombing of Nagasaki, news began spreading across Japan about the devastating power of a new weapon. At first, information was limited and confusing. Many people simply could not believe that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. 2 cities had been devastated within 3 days. Hiroshima on August 6, Nagasaki on August 9. Both attacks had caused destruction on a scale never seen before in human history. As the Japanese government tried to understand the situation, pressure began mounting from multiple directions. The country had already been suffering from years of war. Cities across Japan had been heavily bombed. Resources were running low. And now, the United States had demonstrated a weapon capable of unimaginable destruction. Within a week of the Nagasaki bombing, one of the most important announcements in modern history would be made. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people through a radio broadcast. For many citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. In the speech, he announced that Japan would accept the terms of surrender. World War II was finally coming to an end. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi and millions of others across Japan, the war that had shaped their lives for years was suddenly over. But the scars left behind by those final days would last a lifetime. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long and difficult recovery. Physically, he had survived both atomic explosions, but the damage to his body and the memories of those events would remain with him for the rest of his life. In the weeks following the bombings, many survivors began experiencing symptoms that doctors struggled to explain. People who had appeared healthy suddenly became sick. Hair began falling out. Fevers appeared without warning. Weakness and exhaustion affected thousands of survivors. At the time, very little was known about radiation exposure. Doctors worked tirelessly, but many patients could not be saved. Yamaguchi himself became seriously ill for a period after the bombing. His burns took months to heal, and the long-term effects of radiation would continue to affect his health for years. Yet despite everything he had experienced, he survived. His wife survived. His son survived. Life slowly began to rebuild in the cities that had been devastated by the bombs. For the world, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. But for Tsutomu Yamaguchi, those cities were something more personal. They were the places where he had come face to face with history itself. Twice. And lived to tell the story. In the years following the war, Japan slowly began rebuilding from the devastation left behind by World War II. Cities that had once been reduced to ashes started to rise again. Roads were rebuilt, factories reopened, and families tried to create new lives among the ruins of the past. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, life after the war was both a blessing and a burden. He had survived two of the most destructive events in human history. But survival came with memories that could never truly fade. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained vivid in his mind. The blinding flashes, the overwhelming heat, the sound of buildings collapsing, and the sight of entire cities disappearing in seconds. Like many survivors of war, Yamaguchi rarely spoke about what he had experienced during those days. For many years, he focused on something much simpler, building a life for his family. He returned to work as an engineer for Mitsubishi, helping Japan rebuild its industrial strength during the post-war recovery. Japan's transformation in the decades after the war was remarkable. From the destruction of 1945, the country slowly became one of the world's leading economic powers. Modern cities rose where ruins had once stood. New generations grew up in a world very different from the one Yamaguchi had known as a young man. Yet the memory of the atomic bombings never disappeared. For the survivors, known in Japan as Hibakusha, the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just history. They were personal experiences that shaped their lives forever. And among all those survivors, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story stood apart as something almost unbelievable. A man who had survived not one, but two atomic bombs. For decades, Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived a relatively quiet life. Although many people in Japan knew about the atomic bombings, very few were aware that one man had experienced both explosions. At first, Yamaguchi did not actively seek attention for his story. Like many survivors, he carried the memories privately. But as the years passed, historians and journalists began documenting the experiences of people who had lived through the bombings. During these investigations, Yamaguchi's story slowly began to emerge. It sounded almost impossible. A man who had been present in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb exploded, then returned home to Nagasaki, and survived the second atomic bombing only 3 days later. As researchers confirmed the details of his experience, his story began attracting international attention. Historians carefully examined records, travel documents, and witness accounts. Everything confirmed the same extraordinary truth. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had indeed been present in both cities at the moment the atomic bombs exploded. His story was not a myth. It was history. Eventually, the Japanese government officially recognized him as a double atomic bomb survivor. This recognition made him one of the most unique witnesses to the end of World War II. There were other individuals who had been present in both cities during those days. But Yamaguchi became the most widely known and officially acknowledged survivor of both bombings. His life had become living proof of one of the most extraordinary coincidences in modern history. As Tsutomu Yamaguchi grew older, he began speaking more openly about his experiences. He realized that his survival carried an important message for future generations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had changed the world forever. They marked the beginning of the nuclear age, a time when humanity possessed weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. Yamaguchi believed it was important for people to understand the human side of those events, not just the military or political history, but the lives of ordinary people who had been caught in the middle of history. He spoke about the fear he felt when he saw the first flash in Hiroshima, the confusion and disbelief when the second bomb exploded in Nagasaki, and the long recovery that followed. His message was simple but powerful. No one should ever experience such destruction again. By sharing his story, Yamaguchi hoped that future generations would remember the consequences of nuclear weapons. He had seen their power with his own eyes, twice, and his survival had turned him into one of the most remarkable witnesses of the 20th century.